The arrival. The moving truck groaned to a stop in front of 129, Sycamore Drive, its brakes squealing like an old accordion. Maya Brooks stepped out of the passenger seat, her sneakers crunching on the gravel driveway. She pushed a stray curl from her forehead and took in the scene before her, a street lined with pristine houses painted in neutral tones, each with manicured lawns and identical mailboxes. It was a picture-perfect suburban neighborhood, the kind she'd only seen in TV shows. It was also eerily quiet. No kids playing outside, no lawnmowers humming, not even the faint sound of music drifting through an open window. Instead, the street was blanketed in a silence so thick it felt unnatural. Maya sighed and glanced back at her brother, Marcus, who was unloading boxes from the truck. "What do you think?" she asked, trying to inject some enthusiasm into her voice. Marcus, ever the realist, wiped sweat from his brow and gave the neighborhood a skeptical once-over. "It's nice. A little too step forward for my taste, though. You sure this is what you want?" Maya nodded, her smile faltering slightly. "It's a fresh start. That's all that matters." After years of city life, the noise, the cramped apartments, the constant hustle, Maya had craved something different. When she'd found the listing for this house, tucked away in the quiet suburb of Maplewood Heights, it had felt like a sign. She could finally focus on her art, enjoy some peace, and maybe even build the kind of community she'd always dreamed of. But as the day wore on and Marcus left her to settle in, Maya's excitement gave way to an unsettling realization. No one had come by to introduce themselves. The curtains in nearby houses fluttered occasionally, betraying the presence of watchful eyes, but no one ventured out to say hello. She waved at a man walking his dog, only for him to lower his head and hurry past without so much as a nod. By sunset, the loneliness was creeping in. Maya sat on her porch, sipping a glass of iced tea and watching as the streetlights flickered on one by one. The neighborhood's perfect facade began to feel oppressive, like a painted backdrop hiding something sinister. The next morning, Maya decided to take the first step toward building connections. She'd bake her famous double chocolate chip cookies, a recipe her grandmother had passed down, and deliver them to her neighbors. Food was a universal language, wasn't it? The aroma of freshly baked cookies filled her kitchen, the sweetness chasing away the lingering smell of cardboard and fresh paint. She carefully packed the cookies into a basket, lining it with a cheerful blue cloth. Then, with a deep breath, she set out to knock on doors. Her first stop was the house directly across the street. She climbed the pristine white steps and rang the doorbell. Moments later, the door creaked open, and a man in his 50s peered out. He was tall, with silver hair and a guarded expression. "Hi. I'm Maya Brooks," she began, flashing her warmest smile. "I just moved in across the street and thought I'd bring over some cookies to introduce myself." The man glanced down at the basket, his face unreadable. "That's nice of you," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I'm Doug." "It's great to meet you, Doug," Maya said, holding out the basket. "I hope you like chocolate chip." Doug hesitated before reaching for a cookie. He took a bite, chewing slowly as if testing it for poison. "Not bad," he admitted. "Thanks. I'm looking forward to getting to know everyone," Maya added, trying to keep the conversation going. Doug nodded curtly. "Well, welcome to Maplewood Heights," he said before closing the door. Maya's smile faltered as she stepped back onto the sidewalk. One down, several to go, she thought, trying to stay optimistic. By the time she reached the last house on her block, Maya's energy was waning. Most of her neighbors had been polite but distant, accepting the cookies with forced smiles and hurried goodbyes. Still, she refused to let their indifference dampen her spirit. She rang the doorbell, and after a few moments, the door swung open to reveal a petite woman with sharp features and frosted blonde hair. She looked Maya up and down, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her tone clipped. "Hi, I'm Maya Brooks. I just moved in down the street and wanted to bring over some cookies to say hello. The woman's gaze flicked to the basket. I'm Janet, she said finally. Thanks for the gesture. It's my pleasure, Maya said, holding out the basket. I'm hoping to get to know everyone here. It seems like such a wonderful neighborhood. Janet's expression didn't soften. Maplewood Heights has always been a close-knit community. We value tradition here. Maya forced a smile. That sounds lovely. I'm looking forward to being a part of it. Janet's eyes narrowed slightly. Well, good luck with that, she said before closing the door. Maya stood there for a moment, the basket still in her hands. A lump formed in her throat, but she swallowed it down. Turning on her heel, she walked back to her house, her steps heavy with disappointment. That night, as Maya sat alone in her living room, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was unwelcome. The neighbors' coldness, their veiled comments about tradition and community, it all felt pointed. She tried to convince herself she was imagining things, that they just needed time to warm up to her. But deep down, she knew there was more to it. Maplewood Heights' perfect facade was hiding something ugly, and she was determined to uncover the truth. The Whisper Network. Maya Brooks woke up the next morning with a renewed sense of determination. Despite the lukewarm reception from her neighbors, she was not the type to back down easily. This was her home now, and she was determined to make it work. But as the sun climbed higher in the sky, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about Maplewood Heights. After breakfast, she decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. She had been so focused on unpacking and introducing herself that she hadn't really explored. With her sneakers laced up and her phone tucked into her pocket, she stepped out onto the street, her gaze wandering over the meticulously maintained homes and perfectly trimmed lawns. The air was crisp, and the scent of blooming flowers lingered. It should have felt peaceful, but instead, it felt staged, as if the entire neighborhood was part of an elaborate set. As she strolled past houses, she noticed that almost every window was adorned with the same style of white curtains, drawn just enough to let a sliver of light through. Occasionally, she thought she saw movement behind them, but when she turned to look, the curtains were still. Her steps brought her to the small park at the center of the neighborhood. A cobblestone path wound through neatly arranged flower beds and led to a gazebo in the middle. A few benches were scattered around, but like the streets, the park was empty. Maya sat down on a bench, letting the silence wash over her. She tried to imagine children playing tag on the grass or families having picnics under the trees. But the image felt out of place, almost absurd. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear the footsteps approaching until someone cleared their throat. She looked up to see an older man with a weathered face and kind eyes. He was dressed in khakis and a plaid shirt, and he held a leash attached to a small terrier that wagged its tail enthusiastically. "Good morning," he said, tipping his baseball cap. "You must be the new neighbor." Maya's face lit up with a smile. "That's right. I'm Maya. And you are?" "Howard," he replied, sitting down on the bench next to her. "Howard Mason. I live a few streets over on Willow Lane. Welcome to Maplewood Heights." "Thank you," Maya said, genuinely pleased to finally meet someone who seemed friendly. "It's a beautiful neighborhood." Howard chuckled, his expression turning wry. "It is that. Beautiful and unique. How've you been settling in?" Maya hesitated, wondering how much to share. "It's been fine," she said carefully. "Though, I have to admit, people here seem a little reserved." Howard's smile faded slightly, and he nodded. "That's one way to put it. Reserved is the polite word for it." "What do you mean?" Maya asked, leaning in slightly. Howard glanced around, as if to make sure no one was listening. "You'll find that Maplewood Heights isn't quite as perfect as it looks. Folks here are particular about who they let in, and they don't take well to change." Maya frowned. "I've noticed that. But I figured it was just newcomer nerves. Howard sighed, scratching behind his dog's ears. I've lived here for 20 years, and I've seen it all. They have a way of making you feel welcome if you fit their mold. If you don't, he trailed off, shaking his head. Maya's curiosity was piqued. If you don't, what? Howard's gaze met hers, his expression serious. They'll find ways to let you know. Subtle at first. Cold stares, whispers behind your back. But it can escalate. You've got to be careful, Maya. They don't like people who stand out. Maya's stomach sank. Are you saying I'm not welcome here? Howard's expression softened. Not everyone feels that way. But there's a network, you could say. A group of folks who like to keep things the way they've always been. You'll know them when you meet them. Before Maya could ask more, Howard's dog barked, and he stood up. I've said too much already. Just, keep your head up, and don't let them get to you. Maya watched as he walked away, her mind racing with questions. What had he meant by a network? And why did he seem so nervous about saying more? That afternoon, Maya decided to tackle some yard work. If she was going to make this place feel like home, she needed to put her stamp on it. She pulled on gloves and began trimming the overgrown hedges along her front walkway. As she worked, she noticed Edith, her next-door neighbor, standing on her porch. The older woman was watching her again, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. Maya paused and waved, determined to be polite despite the chilly reception she'd received the day before. Edith didn't wave back. Instead, she turned and went inside, shutting the door firmly behind her. Maya sighed and returned to her work, but the unease lingered. When she finished, she went inside to grab a glass of water. As she passed by the window, she noticed a group of women standing on the sidewalk a few houses down. They were talking in hushed tones, occasionally glancing in her direction. Maya felt a knot form in her stomach. Were they talking about her? She told herself she was being paranoid, but the feeling of being watched was hard to shake. That evening, as Maya was settling in with a book, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Marcus. Marcus, how's it going, sis? Settling in? Maya hesitated before replying. Maya, it's different. The neighborhood is nice, but the people are kind of standoffish. Marcus, want me to come by? I can bring pizza. Maya smiled at the offer but shook her head. She needed to figure this out on her own. Maya, thanks, but I'm good. I just need to give it time. As she set her phone down, she resolved to push through the discomfort. If there was a whisper network working against her, she'd confront it head-on. She wasn't about to let anyone scare her away from the fresh start she'd worked so hard for. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the nagging sense that something darker was at play in Maplewood Heights. The warning. The following morning, Maya awoke to the sound of a faint tapping on her window. She blinked, her eyes adjusting to the light streaming through the curtains. It took her a moment to realize that someone was throwing small pebbles at the glass. She rushed to the window and peeked through the blinds. Standing on the sidewalk was Howard Mason, the elderly man with the terrier she had met the day before. He was holding a leash in one hand and gesturing for her to come outside with the other. His face looked serious, almost worried. Maya hesitated. It was barely 7 a.m., and the neighborhood was still asleep. But the urgency in Howard's expression left little room for debate. She threw on a hoodie and jeans and stepped outside, feeling the cool morning air nip at her skin. Good morning, she called out, her voice low so as not to disturb the quiet. Howard nodded briskly. Morning. I'm sorry to bother you so early, but we need to talk. Walk with me. Without waiting for her response, he turned and started down the street. Maya frowned but followed, her curiosity outweighing her reluctance. The two of them walked in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the rhythmic click of Howard's dog's nails on the pavement. Finally, Howard spoke. "You met Janet yesterday, didn't you?" he asked, his tone heavy. Maya nodded. "She was cordial, I guess." "Why?" Howard let out a bitter laugh. "Cordial. That's one way to describe her. Janet's part of the HOA board. She and her little group run this neighborhood like it's their personal fiefdom. If you're not in their good graces, they'll make your life hell." Maya's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" Howard glanced at her, his eyes filled with a mix of concern and regret. "They have a way of getting under your skin. Parking fines, noise complaints, ridiculous HOA rules. And if that doesn't work, they'll resort to rumors." Maya's brow furrowed. "Rumors? About what?" Howard shook his head. "Doesn't matter. They'll make something up if they have to. They don't like outsiders, especially ones who don't fit their image of what this neighborhood should look like." Maya's mind raced. She'd suspected that her neighbors were wary of her, but she hadn't realized how deep the hostility might run. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Howard stopped walking and turned to face her. "Because you seem like a good person, and I've seen what they can do to people who don't fall in line. I thought maybe, just maybe, someone should warn you." Maya's heart sank. "So what am I supposed to do? Stay quiet and hope they leave me alone?" Howard's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's up to you. But if you fight back, be prepared. They're not above playing dirty." Before Maya could respond, Howard's dog barked, and he tugged on the leash. "I've said my piece. Good luck, Maya. You're going to need it." He turned and walked away, leaving Maya standing alone on the sidewalk. She felt a wave of anger and frustration wash over her. This was supposed to be her fresh start, her chance to build a new life. Instead, she was facing a neighborhood that seemed intent on driving her out. Determined not to let fear dictate her actions, Maya spent the rest of the day working on her yard. She planted flowers, pruned the hedges, and painted the mailbox. If she was going to be under constant scrutiny, she might as well give them something nice to look at. As she worked, she noticed Edith, her next-door neighbor, peering at her from her porch. The older woman's gaze was sharp, like a hawk watching its prey. Maya's first instinct was to ignore her, but she decided against it. "Good afternoon, Edith." Maya called out, waving cheerfully. Edith didn't respond. Instead, she turned and went inside, closing the door firmly behind her. Maya shook her head and returned to her work, refusing to let the cold reception dampen her spirits. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Maya settled on her porch with a cup of tea. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, as usual. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. She looked up to see a woman approaching her house. The woman was tall and striking, with dark hair pulled into a sleek ponytail and a clipboard in hand. "Hello," the woman said, her tone brisk. "I'm Karen Doyle, president of the Maplewood Heights Homeowners Association." Maya stood, forcing a polite smile. "Nice to meet you. I'm Maya Brooks." Karen's eyes scanned Maya's yard, taking in the freshly planted flowers and painted mailbox. "Your yard looks lovely," she said, though her tone lacked warmth. "But I wanted to discuss a few things." Maya's smile faltered. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Karen tapped her clipboard with a manicured finger. "We have certain standards here in Maplewood Heights. Uniformity is important to maintain property values. Your choice of flowers and the color of your mailbox, while creative, don't align with our guidelines." Maya felt her temper flare. "I wasn't aware there were specific rules about that." Karen's smile was tight. "They're outlined in the HOA handbook. I'll make sure you get a copy." Maya crossed her arms. "I see. Is there anything else?" Karen's gaze lingered on Maya for a moment before she spoke. We strive to create a harmonious community here. I'd hate for there to be any misunderstandings. The implied threat was clear, and Maya's jaw tightened. I'll be sure to read the handbook, she said evenly. Karen nodded, satisfied. Welcome to Maplewood Heights, Ms. Brooks. I hope you enjoy your time here. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Maya seething on the porch. It was clear now that Howard's warning hadn't been an exaggeration. The HOA, with Karen at the helm, was watching her every move. Maya took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She had a decision to make: keep her head down and hope for the best, or stand her ground and risk their ire. Either way, she knew one thing for certain. This was war. The escalation. Maya spent the next few days walking on eggshells, her every move seemingly under scrutiny. The standards Karen Doyle mentioned now felt like invisible chains, restricting her freedom to truly make her home her own. Despite her frustrations, Maya remained resolute. If they wanted her to quit, they would be sorely disappointed. She'd fought through bigger challenges in her life, and she wasn't about to let a group of nosy neighbors push her out. However, the first sign of escalation came sooner than expected. One crisp morning, as Maya stepped out to retrieve her mail, she found an envelope tucked neatly under her welcome mat. Her name was scrawled across the front in looping cursive. She frowned, looking around to see if anyone was watching, but the street was as eerily quiet as ever. Inside the envelope was a typed letter, and signed. It read: Ms. Brooks, while we appreciate your efforts to fit in, it's important to remember that Maplewood Heights has a reputation to uphold. Certain behaviors and choices, such as your frequent walks and overly expressive gardening, draw unnecessary attention. Please consider adjusting accordingly. The letter made her blood boil. Frequent walks. Overly expressive gardening. She reread the words, feeling a mix of disbelief and fury. Who had the time or energy to monitor such mundane aspects of her life? She crumpled the letter in her hand and stormed inside, vowing not to let this passive-aggressive nonsense get to her. But as the day wore on, the sense of unease lingered. The following evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Maya heard a knock at her door. She opened it to find Janet and two other women from the neighborhood standing on her porch, their faces masks of forced politeness. Each of them held a clipboard. Maya, Janet began, her tone overly saccharine. We were just making our rounds to check on all the new residents. May we come in for a moment? Maya hesitated. Everything about the situation felt off, but refusing them might only make things worse. Reluctantly, she stepped aside and gestured for them to enter. The women walked in, their eyes scanning every inch of her home. Janet lingered near a shelf of family photos, her lips curling ever so slightly when she saw a picture of Maya and her mother. The other two women busied themselves jotting notes on their clipboards as they inspected her living room and kitchen. What exactly is this about? Maya asked, her arms crossed. Janet turned to her with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Oh, it's just a routine welcome visit. We like to ensure everyone's settling in nicely and adhering to community guidelines. Guidelines? Maya repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. Since when does the HOA have the authority to inspect people's homes? Janet's smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened. It's all in the handbook, dear. You did read it, didn't you? Maya took a deep breath, refusing to rise to the bait. I'll make sure to review it. Good, Janet said, her tone dripping with condescension. We wouldn't want any misunderstandings. After what felt like an eternity, the women finally left, their clipboards filled with notes. Maya watched them go, her jaw clenched. She had never felt so invaded in her own home. Over the next week, the harassment escalated. Maya found herself bombarded with petty notices from the HOA. One day, they fined her for having her trash bins out a few hours early. The next, she received a warning about the excessive brightness of her porch light, even though it was the same bulb the previous owner had used. Each notice was accompanied by thinly veiled threats about maintaining the neighborhood standards. Then came the whispers. Whenever Maya walked to the park or the grocery store, she could feel eyes on her. Conversations would hush as she passed, only to resume in low murmurs. Once, as she rounded a corner, she overheard two women from the HOA talking in hushed tones. "Did you see her out planting flowers again?" one of them said. "It's like she's trying to make a spectacle of herself." "I know," the other replied. "It's so inappropriate. Honestly, she'd be better off somewhere else." Maya's fists clenched, but she kept walking. Confronting them would only feed their narrative. One evening, as Maya sat on her porch trying to enjoy the last rays of sunlight, Howard approached with his terrier in tow. He looked uneasy, glancing over his shoulder before sitting down next to her. "I've been hearing things," he said, his voice low. "Join the club," Maya replied bitterly. "What now?" Howard sighed. "Janet and her group have been spreading rumors. They're saying you're trouble. That you don't respect the community's traditions." Maya laughed humorlessly. "Traditions? Like planting flowers and taking walks. How scandalous." Howard's expression remained serious. "They're ramping up. I don't know what they're planning, but I've seen them do this before. They push until people crack." Maya's heart pounded, but she refused to let fear show on her face. "Well, they're going to be disappointed. I'm not cracking." Howard gave her a look of admiration. "Good. Just, be careful, Maya. They don't fight fair." As Howard walked away, Maya stared out at the darkening street. She had no intention of backing down, but she couldn't deny the weight of the pressure building around her. Something was coming. She could feel it. The retaliation. Maya woke up to the sound of her doorbell ringing incessantly. The shrill chime echoed through the house, each ring feeling like a punch to her already frayed nerves. She threw on a robe and hurried to the door, only to find two uniformed police officers standing on her porch, their expressions unreadable. "Good morning, ma'am," one of the officers said, his voice calm but firm. "We received a report of a disturbance at this address. Mind if we come in?" Maya blinked, her mind racing. "A disturbance? What are you talking about? I haven't done anything." The second officer shifted uncomfortably. "We're just here to follow up. A complaint was filed about excessive noise and suspicious behavior." Maya's heart sank. She knew exactly where this was coming from. She glanced down the street and saw Janet standing at the end of her driveway, arms crossed and a smug expression on her face. A few other neighbors lingered nearby, pretending to check their mail or water their lawns, but their eyes were fixed on Maya's house. "There's been a mistake," Maya said, her voice steady despite the anger bubbling inside her. "I live alone, and I've barely made a sound all morning." The first officer nodded, his gaze softening slightly. "That's probably true, ma'am. But we're required to investigate every report. Do you mind if we take a quick look around?" Maya hesitated. She had nothing to hide, but the idea of strangers invading her space felt like another violation. Still, refusing might only escalate the situation. "Fine," she said, stepping aside. "But make it quick." The officers walked through her home, their boots clunking against the hardwood floors. They checked every room, opening closets and glancing under furniture, as if they expected to find some hidden contraband. When they finally returned to the living room, the first officer offered her a small, apologetic smile. "Everything looks fine here," he said. "Sorry for the trouble, ma'am." Maya forced a tight smile. "No problem. Just doing your job, right?" As the officers left, she closed the door and leaned against it, taking a deep breath. Outside, she heard Janet's voice rise in protest. You're just going to let her off?" Janet demanded. "She's disturbing the entire neighborhood." "Ma'am, there's no evidence of any wrongdoing," one of the officers replied, his tone firm. "If you have further concerns, you can file another report. But for now, this matter is closed." Maya peeked through the blinds and saw Janet's face flush red with anger. It was a small victory, but Maya knew it wouldn't end here. Determined to regain some control, Maya decided it was time to take a stand. She spent the next few days documenting every petty notice, every sideways glance, and every whispered comment she overheard. She even installed a security camera on her porch to capture any suspicious activity. If the HOA wanted to play dirty, she would be ready. But the harassment didn't stop. One morning, Maya found her flower beds trampled, the vibrant petals crushed into the dirt. A handwritten note was pinned to her front door: "This isn't the place for you. Leave." Maya's hands trembled as she read the note. Anger flared in her chest, but it was quickly replaced by a steely resolve. If they thought they could intimidate her, they had underestimated her strength. She took the note to the police station, filing a formal complaint for harassment. The officer at the desk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, assured her that they would investigate. "But without concrete evidence, it'll be hard to press charges," the officer warned. "Do you have any idea who might be responsible?" Maya hesitated. Naming names could escalate the situation, but staying silent might embolden her tormentors. "I'm not sure," she lied. "But I'll keep an eye out." That evening, as Maya was reviewing the footage from her security camera, she caught a glimpse of someone sneaking onto her property. The figure was dressed in dark clothing and moved quickly, pulling something from a bag before crouching near her porch. Maya's heart pounded as she watched the footage, but the person's face was obscured by a hoodie. She forwarded the video to the police, adding it to her growing pile of evidence. But as the days passed with no updates, her frustration mounted. It felt like the system was failing her, just as much as her neighbors were. Then, one afternoon, she received an unexpected knock at her door. Howard stood on her porch, his terrier wagging its tail at her feet. He held a thermos of coffee and a brown paper bag. "Thought you could use a break," he said with a small smile. "I heard about what's been going on." Maya gestured for him to come in, grateful for the company. As they sat in her kitchen, Howard pulled out 2 sandwiches from the bag and handed one to her. "I've seen them do this before," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "They'll keep pushing until you either leave or break. But I've got to say, you're handling it better than most." Maya took a bite of her sandwich, chewing thoughtfully. "I don't want to leave," she said finally. "This is my home. I just wish they'd see that I'm not the enemy." Howard nodded. "They're afraid of anything that disrupts their little bubble. But you've got more allies than you think." Maya raised an eyebrow. "Allies?" Howard smiled. "Not everyone here is on Janet's side. There are a few of us who've been watching, and we're tired of her games. Maybe it's time we did something about it." Maya felt a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. "What do you have in mind?" Howard's smile widened. "Let's just say, it's time to turn the tables." The stand. The next morning, Maya woke up to a renewed sense of purpose. She replayed Howard's words in her mind: "You've got more allies than you think." For the first time in weeks, she felt less alone. If there were others who were tired of Janet and the HOA's overreach, maybe she could rally them to push back. Her first step was to reach out to Howard. They met at the park, where his terrier barked excitedly at the occasional squirrel. Howard came prepared with a notebook and pen, his expression one of quiet determination. "There are a few neighbors who've voiced their frustrations to me over the years," he explained, flipping through the pages. "I think it's time we brought everyone together. Janet's gotten away with her nonsense for too long." Maya nodded. "What's the plan?" Howard tapped the notebook. "We organize a meeting. A chance for people to speak freely and share their experiences. If we can show that her behavior isn't isolated to you, we might have a real case against her and the HOA. Do you think people will come? Maya asked, doubt creeping into her voice. Howard smiled. People are braver when they're not standing alone. You've already inspired more than you realize. Over the next week, Maya and Howard worked tirelessly to spread the word. They slipped invitations into mailboxes, careful to avoid detection by Janet or her loyalists. The flyer was simple but clear. Tired of unfair treatment? Join us to discuss the future of our neighborhood, Tuesday at 7 p.m., Maplewood Park Gazebo. Maya didn't expect much. Maybe a handful of curious residents would show up, and even that felt optimistic. But when Tuesday evening arrived, she was stunned to find the gazebo filled with nearly 20 people. Some were older couples who'd lived in the neighborhood for decades, others were younger families and single professionals like her. All of them wore expressions of frustration and, more importantly, hope. Howard took the lead, standing in the center of the group. Thank you all for coming, he began. I know it's not easy to speak out, but we're here because we're tired of being bullied in our own community. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. For years, Howard continued, Janet and the HOA have wielded their power like a weapon. They've used petty rules and baseless accusations to control and intimidate us. But it stops here. Together, we can demand accountability and create a neighborhood that works for everyone. One woman raised her hand. But what can we actually do? Janet has connections. She'll retaliate if she finds out about this. Maya stepped forward, her voice steady. We document everything. Every fine, every notice, every incident of harassment. If we present a united front, they can't dismiss us as isolated complainers. And if they retaliate, that'll only strengthen our case. A man in his 30s spoke up. We could petition for a vote to remove Janet from the HOA board. If enough of us sign, they'll have to take it seriously. Howard nodded. Exactly. But we'll need as many signatures as we can get. Are you all willing to help spread the word? The group exchanged glances before nodding in agreement. The energy in the gazebo shifted, a sense of empowerment replacing the usual resignation. By the following week, the petition had gained traction. Maya and the other residents went door to door, sharing their stories and gathering signatures. Many were hesitant at first, but once they realized how many others had already signed, their fears began to dissipate. Janet, however, wasn't blind to the growing resistance. She began ramping up her tactics, sending out notices for the most minor infractions. Maya received 3 in one day, one for her recycling bin being slightly ajar, another for a smudge on her driveway, and a third for the excessive use of wind chimes. Maya laughed bitterly as she read the notices. Excessive wind chimes. Is she even trying anymore? Howard chuckled when she showed him the papers. Desperation looks good on her. But the final straw came when Janet scheduled an emergency HOA meeting, clearly intended to undermine their efforts. The notice was delivered to every home, stating that attendance was mandatory and warning that persistent rule violations will not be tolerated. The night of the meeting, the community center buzzed with tension. Maya arrived with Howard and a few other allies, bracing herself for what was to come. Janet stood at the front of the room, flanked by her loyalists, her demeanor icy and commanding. Let's get started, Janet said, her voice clipped. It has come to my attention that certain individuals are attempting to sow discord in our community. This behavior is unacceptable and will be addressed accordingly. Maya's hand shot up. With all due respect, Janet, isn't this meeting supposed to be about community concerns? Because I have plenty to share. Janet's eyes narrowed. You'll have your turn. But Maya didn't wait. She stood, holding up a folder filled with documentation. For months, I've been the target of harassment. Fines, baseless complaints, even threats. And I'm not the only one. She turned to the room. How many of you have received similar treatment? How many of you have felt unwelcome in your own homes? One by one, hands began to rise. Janet's confident facade wavered as the room turned against her. Residents began sharing their stories, each more damning than the last. The tide had shifted, and for the first time, Janet looked unsure. Howard stood, addressing the group. It's clear that this community deserves better. I propose a vote to remove Janet from the HOA board and replace her with someone who values fairness and respect. The room erupted in applause. By the end of the night, the petition to remove Janet had gained overwhelming support. The board had no choice but to schedule a formal vote. As Maya left the meeting, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time since moving to Maplewood Heights, she felt like she truly belonged. Howard caught up to her as she walked to her car. "You did good tonight," he said with a smile. Maya smiled back. "We all did. This is just the beginning."